After embarrassing itself on the Ukrainian battlefield for most of 2022 and 2023, Russia seemed to turn things around in the first few months of 2024, taking advantage of the fact that the $61 billion Ukrainian military aid package from the US was stalled in Congress. The country finally managed to regain battlefield initiative and capture some key territories. The Ukrainian stronghold of Avdiivka fell under Russian control. The villages of Semenivka, Pervomaiska, and Novobakhmutivka followed suit. After fierce battles raging around Chaziv Yar, a city pivotal for Russian advances in the Donetsk Oblast, Russia managed to capture parts of it. The Ukrainian forces started retreating from several areas of the Donbass after being badly outgunned and outmanned by their Russian foes. In other words, everything was falling into place for Russia. So you'd think that Russian President Vladimir Putin would be pretty confident and secure in his position, right? Wrong. It's quite the opposite, really. As July was nearing its end, Putin was in full panic mode. For the first time since the invasion of Ukraine started on February 24, 2022, one realization seems to have started settling in. Russia may have lost the war in Ukraine. But how did we get here? What caused Putin, a man known for his ruthless calculation and steely resolve, to face such crushing dread? And how did Russia go from seeming triumph to the precipice of defeat? We've got all the answers for you in this video. After hearing that Putin is in full panic mode, you might understandably ask a single question. How do you know that? After all, it's not like Putin is likely to broadcast his fears for the world to see. Well, the truth is that actions often speak louder than words. And even the words used often reek of desperation and fear, even though they're meant to project power. As hard as Russia is trying to keep this facade of strength, the cracks are beginning to show. So before examining what made Putin go into full panic mode, let's take a closer look at the key signs of his crumbling confidence. Putin's shocking cabinet reshuffle in May of 2024 was the first major sign that he felt his grip on power weakening. In a move that sent shockwaves around the globe, Putin replaced his long-standing Minister of Defense and longtime friend and close ally, Sergei Shoigu, with an economist with no military experience, Andrei Belousov. Now, for the most part, this move was seen as the most obvious sign that Russia was placing its economy on a war footing, preparing for a long war in Ukraine and beyond. But beneath the surface, this reshuffle signaled more than just an economic pivot. It signaled that Putin's worst fear, the rise of his Kremlin rivals, was potentially becoming a reality once again. And after the disastrous impact of Yevgeny Prigozhin's June 2023 rebellion, Putin couldn't take any chances. By removing Shoigu from his post, Putin effectively neutralized an ally who became a little too powerful for Putin's liking. Most Russians perceived Shoigu as a familiar and respected minister who had served Russia honorably for 12 years. Putin also believed this before the invasion of Ukraine, sharing quite a close and public friendship with Shoigu. But as the situation in Ukraine worsened, the Russian public had to bid farewell to the many macho photos of Putin and Shoigu sunbathing bare-chested in Siberia, going on fishing trips and playing hockey. The choice between friendship and power proved to be an easy one for Putin. And that's precisely what the Russian political scientist Mikhail Sava believes Putin achieved by removing Shoigu from his cabinet. He removed any threat to his power. Shoigu's replacement, Belousov, described as a trustworthy bureaucrat, is only interested in economic matters. He has no ambitions to lead the Russian armed forces, build a parallel power base, or even meddle in important military issues. The general staff of the Russian armed forces will be in charge of those, while Belousov focuses on securing the necessary funding for Russia's war machine. Belousov also doesn't have a loyal base of supporters like Shoigu. He's just a scientist who owes his position to Putin alone, and thus Putin alone warrants his loyalty. To secure this loyalty from other key figures in the cabinet, Putin started appointing their children to high-profile positions and lucrative state contracts. So Dmitry Patrushev, the son of Nikolai Patrushev, who many consider to be the second most powerful man in Russia, was appointed Deputy Prime Minister for Agriculture. Similarly, Boris Kovalchuk, the son of Yuri Kovalchuk, reputed to be Putin's personal banker, became the chairman of the Accounts Chamber of Russia. Through these moves, Putin is also securing the loyalty of the next generation of political leaders, eliminating future threats to his regime. Of course, there are no guarantees in the cruel world of politics, as Prigozhin proved, so Putin's efforts to fortify his position are fraught with risk. But even if they weren't, even if they were rock solid, the mere fact that Putin was forced to make these moves speaks volumes about his current state of mind. So do Putin's threats of nuclear war. Now, we know what you're thinking, old news. And yes, Putin has been threatening to deploy nuclear weapons virtually since the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion. However, the threats and this dangerous rhetoric dramatically intensified in the last few months, clearly showing just how desperate and panicked Putin is. In an effort to convince the world he isn't bluffing once again, he reiterated that Russia would use all means at its disposal to protect its sovereignty at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He added, for some reason, the West believes that Russia will never use it. Conveniently ignoring the very reason for this belief is his history of making empty threats and nuclear saber-rattling. Of course, Russian officials, state media, and publications are quick to take Putin's word for it, plastering nuclear threats across headlines and broadcasting them with fervor. But these threats aren't the only outlandish thing the Russian media keeps pushing. Believe it or not, Russia's state-controlled media outlets are now trying to convince Russian people to join the war by promising them that they will be resurrected if they get killed on the battlefield. Yep, you heard that right. The state media is also painting Russia's invasion as a holy war, presenting the Russian armed forces as the embodiment of the forces of good and describing individual soldiers as the forerunners of Jesus' forces. It's a lethal mix of delusion and desperation. However, in actuality, the desperation in this department is quite justified, given how many troops Russia has lost in Ukraine. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost as many as 570,120 troops. Combine this staggering number of casualties with the two waves of forced mobilization, 137,000 troops in August 2022 and 170,000 troops in December 2023, combined with the 300,000 Russian citizens who had fled the country, and it becomes obvious that the Kremlin is facing a dire manpower crisis. The fact that he's gradually running out of soldiers to send to certain death might have contributed to Putin's apparent readiness to hold peace talks, announced on June 14th. While this would surely be monumental news coming from any other warring leader, in Putin's case it's tinged with skepticism, especially when the terms Putin proposes for this peace initiative heavily favor Russia's strategic interests rather than offering any genuine concessions. According to him, fighting would stop if Ukraine would withdraw its troops from the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts and refuse to join NATO. Ukraine, on its part, slammed this proposition as an ultimatum, labeling his options for ending the war as absurd. Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, also added that these statements contained nothing new. But Minister Kuleba is wrong. There is something new in Putin's June 14th statement, a hint of desperation. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte was the first to point this out publicly. During the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, Rutte said that Putin's alleged readiness to hold peace talks indicates that he's panicking. His exact words were, "Obviously, since he came up with this crazy proposal for peace yesterday, it shows us that he's panicking." However, Rutte still seems to believe peace is possible for the war in Ukraine and that it could be achieved at a similar summit. In fact, the Dutch official voiced his disappointment over Putin not attending the June 2024 summit in Switzerland, saying, "The train will not move without Russia." To be fair, Russia and Putin weren't invited to attend the Global Peace Summit, which ended up hosting about 100 delegations with 57 heads of state and governments from all over the world. However, the reason why Russia wasn't invited was the country's public flagging that it would not participate. But even if it did, it would hardly change anything. Putin needs the war in Ukraine to continue for his regime to survive. If the war comes to an end, regardless of the side that prevails, he will be left to grapple with the disastrous consequences of his war economy that Russians will no longer be able to ignore. Then again, Russians are already starting to catch on, despite the relentless propaganda keeping them in the dark. And they have a single item to thank, the first reason on our list for Putin to panic: eggs. That's right, eggs have come to symbolize the economic turmoil in Russia. They've become so expensive that they're even sold individually in some shops, going for as high as 23 cents an egg. Of course, they aren't alone, with numerous other basic ingredients soaring in price due to massive labor market shortages, high energy costs, and the plunging ruble. The situation has gotten so dire that Putin fears Russians might take to the streets to protest. This is also the first of many occurrences that set off Putin's panic mode, which we'll discuss in this video. In the same way Putin fears the rise of Kremlin rivals, he also fears the power of public unrest. That's why his regime ordered the Russian security services to take action and finally address the shocking prices and shortage of eggs and other staples. Russia is even resorting to importing eggs from Turkey and Azerbaijan to fill the gap, a stark contrast to the 98% of nationally sourced eggs before the war. Of course, eggs are far from the only reason why Putin is in full panic mode, and far from the most crucial one. That honor belongs to the second reason on our list, which is that Ukraine is now allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to strike targets on Russian soil. This monumental decision came in May 2024, when ally after ally started giving Ukraine the green light on the matter, instantly sending Putin into full panic mode. You see, before May, Ukraine was only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons on Russian targets within Ukrainian territory, that is, the parts occupied by Russia. This allowed Russia to wreak havoc all across Ukraine, while Ukraine was only allowed to respond within the confines of its own borders. With this new change of policy, Ukraine can use a wide variety of advanced weaponry to strike Russian targets beyond the occupied Ukrainian regions. However, there's also a major but involved. Ukraine can target Russian territory, but only within specific areas and military targets. For instance, the Russian armed forces launched a massive offensive in the Kharkiv region on May 10th, so the US allowed Ukraine to hit the Russian targets surrounding this border region, which were heavily involved in carrying out this offensive. Other countries like France, Germany, and the UK followed suit, allowing Ukraine to do the same with the weapons they supplied. But what kinds of weapons are we talking about here? Well, Ukraine can use most of its air defense systems, rockets, and artillery. Long-range missiles are still off limits, but this new policy shift opens up a range of high-impact options. To be more specific, Ukraine can now use the following weapons and equipment to strike predefined targets in Russia. The F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jet supplied by the Netherlands and Denmark, Su-25 close air support jets donated by Northern Macedonia, Scalp Egg air-launched cruise missiles supplied by France, Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles delivered by the UK, the Bayraktar TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicles provided by Turkey, and HIMARS and ATACMS missiles supplied by Germany, the US, UK, and Norway. Of course, the permission to use these weapons on Russian soil alone is by no means enough for Ukraine to win the war. However, it's more than enough to finally shift the balance of power and give Russia the taste of its own medicine. As an anonymous senior Ukrainian officer put it in a call with CNN, the Russian military can no longer feel impunity and security. The newly granted permission has already had a huge impact, allowing Ukraine to destroy several important targets inside Russia and conduct a successful counteroffensive. It's also stopped Russia from targeting the Kharkiv region with its S-300 and S-400 systems. How so? Ukraine started carrying out strikes on targets in the Belgorod region using the HIMARS missiles, which forced the Russians to move their surface-to-air missile systems much further away, putting ground targets in Kharkiv out of their range, that range being 75 miles for the S-300 system and 120 miles for its S-400 counterparts. As for the aerial targets like aircraft and missiles, both systems have an operational range of 250 miles. When struck by Ukrainian HIMARS, these systems were located roughly 40 miles from the front line in the Kharkiv region and 50 miles from the city of Kharkiv itself. Safeguarding Kharkiv from the S-300 threat has provided significant relief to the city of Kharkiv, which is also targeted by aerial glide bombs dropped from fighter jets from a distance of some 40 miles. However, there's one particular target that seems to be inducing the most panic in the Kremlin: the Crimean Bridge. As its name suggests, the 12-mile bridge is located on the Crimean Peninsula and serves as a crucial artery connecting the peninsula to mainland Russia. Since its construction in 2018, this bridge, also known as the Kerch Strait Bridge, has facilitated the movement of Russian troops, supplies, and resources between the peninsula and the mainland. However, the bridge has also served as a symbol of Russian control and a testament to Moscow's claims over Crimea, which makes it one of the prime targets for Ukrainian forces. So far, Ukraine has managed to hit the bridge twice, in October 2022 and July 2023. Both times, strike drones were involved in the attack. While these strikes managed to badly damage parts of the bridge, they failed to achieve Ukraine's ultimate goal, completely severing Russia's crucial supply line to Crimea. But the newly delivered ATACMS, a coveted long-range missile system manufactured in the US with a range of up to 190 miles, could change this. That's why the renewed flow of military aid from the US to Ukraine is another source of panic for Putin and the Kremlin, the third on our list. But how do we know Ukraine is eyeing the Crimean Bridge? Well, besides the obvious strategic value of this bridge, a senior Ukrainian diplomat has also dropped a major hint. In a post shared to X, formerly Twitter, Sergei Kyslytsya, Ukraine's permanent representative in the United Nations, listed 6 main types of bridges. Each of the types was accompanied by a diagram showing what the bridge type looks like. But in the 6th slot, there weren't any bridges, just an empty space with the words Kerch. For those who can read between the lines, the message was more than clear. The Kerch Bridge will be no more. The 4th reason for Putin's justified panic is the overall change in how the West approaches the war. For the better part of almost 30 months of warfare, the US and Western allies weren't going all in to help Ukraine. First, the West was wary of provoking Russia too much, fearing the escalation that might ensue. It's almost as if Ukraine wasn't allowed to win the war because of what a Russian loss might mean for the rest of Europe. Next, the West was seemingly hoping Putin would stop at some point, realizing that his aggressive expansionism would ultimately be unsustainable and self-defeating. This is also partially why the US waited for so long before greenlighting the use of its weapons inside Russia. Think of it this way: Ukraine doesn't want the war to continue. The US doesn't want the war to continue. NATO doesn't want the war to continue. and the rest of the world doesn't want the war to continue. It was only logical to assume that Russia could also be added to that list. Unfortunately, it became evident that Putin had no intention of stopping. In addition, he's obviously looking to expand the war beyond the Ukrainian borders. As a result, the West finally realized that a change of tactics was more than necessary. So the strategy is no longer Russia can't lose and Ukraine can't win. The strategy is now Ukraine will win the war. Ukrainian armed forces have seemingly sensed the change, lending them to fight more valiantly than ever. This leads us to the fifth source of Putin's panic: Ukraine's everlasting resilience. Even though Ukrainian forces are the ones heavily outgunned and outnumbered, the Russian troops are the ones taking more hits. According to Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Russia suffers 3 times the number of casualties than Ukraine. In some areas, this ratio is even higher. Russia has also suffered heavy equipment losses since the beginning of the invasion. According to the July 24th report from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost the following equipment in the war: 8,302 tanks, 16,013 armored fighting vehicles, 21,279 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,759 artillery systems, 1,125 multiple launch rocket systems, 902 air defense systems, 363 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 12,544 drones, 28 ships and boats, 1 submarine. Of course, Ukraine has suffered heavy losses in this department as well, but not before taking full advantage of the equipment. For instance, a UK-based think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, estimated that Ukraine loses a staggering 10,000 drones monthly, but this high figure has to do with Ukraine's aggressive use of drones in combat roles. Simply put, Ukrainian drones have been wreaking havoc on Russia. They are the reason the Black Sea Fleet has all but retreated from Crimea, despite standing against a country that has virtually no navy. Ukraine has also been using drones to sow panic and fear across Russia, wiping out major targets in the process. The targets in question are mostly air bases, oil depots, and industrial sites. In other words, locations whose destruction can disrupt Putin's relentless war machine. In one of the latest attacks, 47 drones targeted the Rostov region, badly damaging the Morozovsk air base, home to various Russian fighter jets, including Su-34s, Su-24s, and Su-24Ms. The 5 areas that were hit were the location of an S-300-400 air defense system, the parking area of an Su-24 fighter jet, another parking area for fighter jets, a fuel and lubricants warehouse, and the runway. With strategic moves aimed at appeasing the people of Russia and its government, it's clear that Ukraine remains the biggest threat to the survival of Putin's regime. After all, we're talking about a man who takes out his opponents almost preemptively before they get a real chance to threaten his grip on power. Think Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. So the fact that this great enemy of Russia, Ukraine, just won't relent and continues to challenge his authority is a source of profound anxiety for Putin. The same goes for his many miscalculations in the war in Ukraine, the sixth source of panic. Remember, the very invasion of Ukraine was launched based on a miscalculation. Putin's yes men promised him that he could take Kyiv in 3 days or so after swarming it with 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles. Of course, this didn't happen. Kyiv is still very much standing. Since the beginning of the invasion, there has been one miscalculation after another, and even Putin, despite his usual arrogance, can't ignore the mounting evidence of his errors. Speaking of his miscalculations, another international one is sure to make Putin sweat: Joe Biden dropping out of the 2024 US presidential race. You see, Putin was all but convinced that Donald Trump would get re-elected in November, as his opponent was widely painted as an old and sickly man who can't be trusted to lead the most powerful nation in the world. Of course, this worked in Putin's favor, as Trump famously promised to shake up NATO, even threatening to pull the US from the alliance altogether. With a weakened NATO, Putin would have little trouble advancing his strategic ambitions, both in Ukraine and beyond. But Putin's dreams of an easy path to victory were shattered on July 21, 2024, when it was announced that Biden would no longer run for re-election and that he endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, as his replacement. The news stirred up quite the commotion in the US and the rest of the world, Russia very much included. Russian state officials started complaining on national TV that Biden's move was a disaster for Trump's re-election chances. As Oleg Matvichev, a member of the State Duma, put it, previously, Trump could easily attack Biden's health. Now he has nothing left to attack. He added that Trump's campaign switched to attacking Harris, but nothing new will stick to her. Of course, the US presidential race is far from over, but it's easy to see why Putin and those around him are panicking. If elected, Harris's policy toward Ukraine is likely to remain similar to Biden's, which means support for as long as it takes. Harris has previously attended 3 consecutive Munich security conferences, meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky at each. Though her first appearance was 5 days before the full-scale invasion started, Harris used the other 2 meetings with Zelensky to reiterate US support for Ukraine. Harris has also continuously reiterated that Russia must pay for its war crimes, which shouldn't be surprising, given her background as Attorney General. She also insists that the only way for the war in Ukraine to end is with Ukraine as a nation that is free, democratic, and independent. So there you have it. Putin's full panic mode now makes much more sense, doesn't it? But the good news is that the West still has a few cards up its sleeve, which could easily push Putin into an even deeper state of desperation. The first is to allow Ukraine to hit more targets using Western-supplied weapons. Though lifting all limitations is the ultimate goal, even a simple expansion beyond areas directly targeting Ukraine would do wonders for the country's war effort. Ideally, Ukraine should be able to hit Moscow, because there's no more important city in the entire country. Russia is Moscow, and Moscow is Russia. For now, the people of Moscow are mostly unaware of the war raging some 500 miles away. Sure, they've experienced the fluctuating economy, but they have no idea of the full scale of devastation and chaos unfolding in Ukraine. The Russian elites were a bit shaken when the war first started, but by now they're used to it, giving it no second thought in their day-to-day lives. So the only way to truly get to Putin is to make Russia feel the war. As the Ukrainian historian Yuri Felshtinsky puts it, Felshtinsky believes that it's also the only way to ultimately defeat Russia and prevent further escalation. The West, and the US in particular, can also instill more fear in Putin by providing additional military aid to Ukraine. After all, in the 5 months when US aid was withheld was when Russia turned the tables. Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are vocal about the massive impact this aid has. In the words of an officer with the 148th Artillery Brigade, "We can see the impact of the aid every day. Artillery, longer-range multiple-launch rocket systems with various types of ammunition and submunitions, it's affecting the overall battlefield picture." The last thing that the West can do to make Putin sweat doesn't have anything to do directly with Ukraine. It refers to changing the regime in Belarus, Russia's only remaining ally in the region. While Alexander Lukashenko is in power, Putin will continue using Belarus as a starting point for his military operations in the region, potentially advancing against the entirety of Europe. Recently, Putin even moved part of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons arsenal to Belarus, suggesting that the first nuclear strikes could be launched from this territory. Defeating Putin, while the war is still limited to only Ukraine, is the only way to prevent a World War III-like escalation, and taking Lukashenko out of the picture would certainly help achieve that goal. Of course, there's always the question of what Putin will do if he's backed into a corner. As of 2024, Russia possesses 5,850 nuclear warheads, the most in the world, which is why a nuclear war is the first thing to come to mind when thinking of a potential escalation. It doesn't help that Putin has been rather cavalier about the potential use of these weapons, leaving the rest of the world in just as much panic as he's currently experiencing. But what do you think? Is there a way to push Putin to the edge without provoking World War III? And if so, what do you think will be the straw that breaks the camel's back? Share your opinions in the comments section below, and as always, thank you for watching. Now go and check out Ukraine is Winning the War Again, or click this other video instead.